its security and project itself culturally. However, all of these efforts will be vain if Europe is not animated by European sentiment. These quotes, I believe, resonate very powerfully with us today in the light of the two dramatic and life-changing events that we're experiencing, both COVID pandemic and war in Europe. I'm Isabelle Schwarz, I'm the head of the public policy at ECF, and I have the pleasure to moderate this session tonight. And I'm joined by 4 exquisite speakers from very different parts of Europe. Let me introduce them to you. On my right, Monica Sassatelli, who is professor in sociology of culture at Bologna University, with a very vast range of research interests regarding arts and culture, culture policies, and creative industries. Then Peter Giessen, who is a well-known face here in the Netherlands. He's a political editor and commentator of Europe at the daily the Volkskrant, and has been also correspondent for the Volkskrant 5 years in Paris. Then Galyna Solovei, a very special and warm welcome to you. Galyna is from Ukraine. She's a senior lecturer at one of the most prestigious universities of Ukraine, at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy at the International Relations Department, where she teaches conflict analysis. She was forced, if I may, to share this. She was forced to flee her country and under extremely difficult conditions via Lviv to Berlin, arrived in the Netherlands with her 3 daughters. And now she's teaching conflict analysis at the Amsterdam University. She's also an international experience, having have a second education also in South Korea and lived and worked in Mexico. And last not least, Pawel Zerka, who is the author of the report we will hear more about, is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations at the Paris office, and he's engaged in very different opinion polls, trying to understand what are the kind of political strategies that are possible to engage a European demos in our project Europe. So I would pass the word now to Pawel to introduce us to the results of the European Sentiment Compass.
I'll do it.
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot, Isabelle, and thanks a lot to the European Cultural Foundation for your trust and support in doing these projects together and in exploring together the European sentiment. I believe it was also for you a very fruitful experience. You mentioned the pandemic and war, the 2 crises that we have been living through for the past couple of years. In the troubled times such as these, it is important to understand where we are and where we are going. And this concerns each and every one of us, but it also concerns the European project, which after the COVID pandemic and after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has been confronted with serious challenges, but it has also been confronted with fundamental questions about its own nature and direction. And one can use different methods in order to explore the, let's call it, state of the union. So, for example, one can do public opinion polling, and this is what European Commission's Eurobarometer is doing, but also other organizations, including my own ECFR, we are engaged in doing public opinion polling across the European Union. One can also use experiments in participatory democracy, such as the conference on the future of Europe, which is being closed today, as we speak, in Strasbourg. And so with the European Sentiment Compass, we have tried to use yet another method. And this we used the ECFR's network of 27 associate national researchers in order to map the debates about different issues different European issues in each country of the European Union. And not only did we do this with this method, but also we adapted a very specific prism to that analysis, which is the prism of the European sentiment, a concept which several of the union's founders used several decades ago, mostly just after the Second World War, and which we believed could be useful again as a concept through which to analyze where Europe is right now. And while doing this analysis, we focused on three issues in particular. First, on what has the COVID pandemic done to the attitudes towards Europe across the EU 27. Secondly, we looked at the attitudes towards Europe in five specific areas: one of international security, then climate and energy, migration, rule of law, and finally financial solidarity, trying to understand whether those issues have the potential to improve attitudes towards Europe or to harm them, whether they would bring Europeans closer to each other or rather drift them farther apart. And finally, the third issue that we analyzed was the one concerning the role of culture and the media in bringing Europeans together, based on the assumption that both sectors play a crucial role in allowing for the emergence of the European sentiment. So based on this, we have produced the European Sentiment Compost, which is both a data tool that you can explore freely, so that you see the different perceptions of the EU member states on particular issues. But it's also a story where we interpret the data in a very specific way. So let me go with you with just a selection of some of our findings. And so first, on the effects of the COVID pandemic, we have concluded that this has largely been a consolidating experience for the EU as a political project. And we came to that conclusion based on several sources of data. First, we asked our researchers, and this was the only question where we asked them for their personal opinion on something, but we asked them what's their opinion on how the pandemic has affected the feeling of Europeanness among their country's society. And we have learned that in no country this has been a mostly alienating experience. Actually, in many countries, this has been an experience which our researchers have told us has clearly strengthened the European sentiment across within their countries. Then we have also looked at the available public opinion polls, such as the Eurobarometer, and here is the data on the question of trust in the European Union. As you can see, that the gray area is the area of the COVID pandemic. Just after the pandemic, there has been a drop in trust in European Union in some countries, such as Italy and Malta, which you can see on this chart. But this has recovered ever since, because Europeans have shown each other a lot of solidarity. Currently, the average trust in the EU is only slightly larger than the level that was represented just before the pandemic. But we believe that behind the data there is something else, that even if trust is similar to the one before the pandemic, the expectations have shifted, and Europeans have much more expectations towards the European Union right now than they used before. Coming from Paris, I go regularly to the meetings to show solidarity with Ukraine in Paris. And during those gatherings, you can frequently hear calls that if Europe has been able to agree on the financial solidarity recovery package during the COVID pandemic, why shouldn't it agree on halting energy imports from Russia right now. There are a lot of expectations vis-à-vis Europe. Those expectations can be disappointed, but the mere fact that they are there, I believe, is important. And also, what we have seen, based on the research in 27 EU countries, is that also the member state governments have become more pro-European or more focused on Europe. In no country have we seen a shift towards more anti-European or Eurosceptic positions, whereas in several countries we have actually seen the other process, including the Netherlands, which after the change of the government after your last parliamentary elections has also clearly become more pro-European. As a result, currently Europe is led by countries, including the Netherlands or Germany, which talk about European sovereignty, something which 5 years ago was only discussed by the French president. Let me now move to the second issue that we analyzed, which is about 5 policy issues. The most important finding probably is that on all of those issues, we have noticed that they have more of a potential to improve attitudes towards Europe rather than be likely to harm those attitudes. If we just count the number of countries that represent different positions. So this is, for me, a central graph of the whole tool, which shows that most of those 5 policy areas are in the blue, which means that there are several member states where the dominating perception is that those issues should improve attitudes towards Europe in those countries. When you explore the tool, you can see which of the countries we talk specifically about. Let me just very quickly say a couple of words about international security, which is the area which is the most likely to have the potential of improving the European sentiment in Europe, with altogether 23 countries where this is seen as being likely to improve to improve attitudes towards Europe. And as you can see, this is a particularly strong perception in countries like Germany or Estonia or Italy. The sole exception is Denmark, a country which in June will be holding a referendum on its exemptions on its opt-outs in the security and defense realm. And according to our researcher in Denmark, this is likely to make this issue more divisive and in this sense harm the attitudes towards Europe. And on the other side of the spectrum, like international security is improving in European attitudes. So on the other side of the spectrum, climate and energy seems to be an area which is the most likely to provoke divisions in Europe. And this is partly because climate is susceptible to being perceived through the prism of a dilemma between pursuing our climate ambitions on the one hand, or cutting our dependency on Russian fossil fuels on the other hand. I believe that this does not have to be a dilemma, but I clearly see that in the political discussions this is often framed as one. And you can see that there are 8 countries where the dominating perception is that this issue could provoke divisions and harm the attitudes towards Europe. Those countries include Poland, for example, or Bulgaria. And I will not be going through the rest of the policy fields. I will keep that for the discussion. But let me quickly go to the third and final issue that we have analyzed in the European sentiment compass, which is about the role of culture and the media. We believe that both culture and media need resources and freedom to perform their roles in allowing the European sentiment to emerge. And this is through that prism that we have identified specific problems in those areas. So when it comes to the cultural sector, problems concern financial difficulties after the COVID pandemic. And in most EU members, it has been flagged that the pandemic has had a devastating effect on the cultural sector. At the same time, there is still another issue of whether there is freedom of cultural expression and whether public policies do not promote too much nationalistic discourses. And those two issues seem to be particularly a problem in two countries, Hungary and to a lesser extent, Poland. Then looking at the media, we've noticed that the problems concern, of course, the media freedom. And just a couple of days ago, the Reporters Without Borders have published their new report on freedom of the media, showing that there has been another decline in that area. But there is also a problem of media literacy, and unfortunately, countries where are often the same where those two problems appear. So this is what you can, for example, see in on that chart, which is also part of our report, where you can see that there are countries who are strong on media literacy and media freedom, such as Finland, Denmark, Ireland, and Estonia. And there are those on the other side of the spectrum, like Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, who are doing very poorly on both media literacy and media freedom. But still, it's interesting to analyze those two issues separately, because, for example, when you compare Hungary to Poland, then even if both are doing poorly on media freedom, then it's still promising that the Polish society has a strong media literacy compared to Hungary. In this sense, despite lack of media freedom, one can expect that media can still play a useful role in also discussing European issues. But a third, less debated problem about media, which we flag in our report, is that also in those countries which in theory have more of media freedom, more of media literacy, there is also a problem of the media ecosystem being infiltrated by Russian interests and of there being a lot of complacency towards Russia. Just recently, you probably remember there has been a case of Sergei Lavrov giving a long interview to an Italian TV, or The Guardian has published some pieces which were quite strange for that newspaper. And in France as well, we have seen the spokesman of Kremlin recently giving an interview to one of the French private TV station. One final word, or also about those culture and media. There are, of course, several promising policy initiatives which we mention in our work, but we also propose some of the other recommendations too. So you can also explore the sentiment compass if you are in need for those recommendations. But let me finish with two very quick and broad conclusions, which are, so we started with the pandemic and how this has affected the European sentiment. But I think that right now we are no longer in the pandemic mood, we are in the war mood. And this is the moment where even if those expectations vis-a-vis Europe have increased during the pandemic, they are now getting tested in the context of war. And this is not an easy test. And that's why we believe that leaders need a compass. But what I'm mostly concerned about is that, as I already mentioned, they might be tempted to see some things as dilemmas. So one dilemma is between climate urgency and the urgency to become energetically sovereign on energy. There is a fear that because of the need to cut dependency on Russia, we might conclude that we need to make our ambitions on the climate agenda less ambitious, which could be devastating for the European sentiment of many European citizens. A second dilemma is between rule of law and geopolitics. And my country that I'm coming from, Poland, is in the center of that dilemma, because I see that there is a temptation to seek some sort of a compromise with the Polish government on the rule of law issue in order to ensure that there is a geopolitical unity, or as much as possible of that unity, because Hungary is another problem, within the European Union. And I'm just wondering where that compromise on rule of law could be. Who would compromise more, Brussels or Warsaw? And there is a third dilemma, which is the one between financial solidarity, with rising calls for another round of financial solidarity across Europe. Those calls are justified because the effects of war on European economies are uneven, and that war was not possible to be expected. And also, in order to ensure support behind the sanctions on Russia, you might need to support some countries more, especially since some countries also host more Ukrainian migrants or refugees. And therefore, there is this discussion about financial solidarity, but I believe that the COVID pandemic has made that call both more and less possible. It's a bit paradoxical. So it made it more possible because we have already broken the taboo of financial solidarity. But at the same time, it's less possible because also all the economies are in a greater trouble right now, and the issue of financial stability is at stake here. And finally, a second big conclusion for me from that walk is that we are going through a deeply cultural moment. And this is, first of all, because all of those issues like migration, climate, are deeply cultural. About climate, actually, we can say that there are cultural wars right now. And migration is obviously a cultural issue, but this shows that we are entering into a moment where we cannot no longer hope that there can easily be found depoliticized solutions to our challenges. We need to engage culturally, and this means engage also with citizens. And here is where the role of free media and free culture is so important, because these are the channels through which this European sentiment can emerge, and the flow of ideas needs to be open. In this sense, exercises like today's, like the conference on the future of Europe, are useful, but they will not be sufficient, because in a way we need a permanent discussion about the future of Europe. And for such a discussion, we need to have resilient and free media and culture. I finish on this note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pawel. Join us here, and let's start the conversation. I think on one hand, you gave a pretty positive sort of appreciation of a sort of consolidation again of the trust in most of the 27 EU countries, and a sort of greater expectations from citizens towards Europe that is opening actually a new path, a new opportunity also for Europe. But at the same time, of course, there's these big challenges related both to media freedom, media literacy, media pluralism, control of media, and then, of course, terribly, the situation in Ukraine. So we need to balance this. And I would like to start our conversation maybe actually with Peter. Changed my mind. With Peter, because I thought following the presentation it would be interesting to hear from you. Sort of what is your first reaction to this reading of the results of the 27 researchers?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think indeed, as Pawel said, the crisis of pandemic and the war in Ukraine have favored common European sentiment. And you can see that very well, I think, in Holland, where there's really been a shift in politics, but also in society. And in politics, it has to do, of course, with another government. But also I think in society where we used to see the European Union very long time as a kind of market which earns us a lot of money, but it shouldn't cost us too much. And we really shouldn't have to pay for the Italians and the Greeks and the Spaniards and so on. So it was quite narrow-minded vision of Europe. I think the pandemic has changed that a bit because it shows how interdependent we are. There was a kind of European public space, or perhaps a little bit of a European demos, if you like. Because you could really see that if the neighbors don't fix their problems, we're in trouble too. So everyone noticed how interdependent we are. But the thing above all, it showed how vulnerable our system is. And we noticed how little is produced in Europe itself. And for a long time we had many products made on the cheap in China or other countries. And now, all of a sudden, you saw what happens if supply lines are being cut off. And that gave us, I think, a sense of vulnerability. And that's also why, a concept like European sovereignty, which was seen 5 years ago as a quite outlandish, typically French subject, being presented in order to favor French industry. Is now more accepted also in the Netherlands. And of course the war that has enormous influence, you really can see it's a very bad time to be on your own now.
Maybe a little provocative, thank you, maybe a little provocative question to add on. I mean, there's the issue of vulnerability and solidarity. They are quite close together, and strategic autonomy and sovereignty. What does it mean now in the Dutch context? Would you say that because of that more pro-European engagement, the Netherlands would actually also be ready to pay more?
Oh, they do.
No, but more than, because, we have the stories of the frugals. And
yeah, of course. But you saw that, of course we had to, because the Germans, they changed their policies. And we noticed it very late. And we thought we could stay frugal, and then the Germans made a shift, and then we were quite alone. But I think that we're actually more prepared to pay for other countries than before.
Good.
Yeah.
Good news.
But sorry.
Yeah.
If I may,
I
think what Pawel said, whether this common European sentiment, whether it will last, depends on, of course, whether the European Union delivers on all kinds of issues, from climate change to migration, etc. But also, perhaps very briefly, it depends on developments in the member states themselves, I think, and I think especially on the French elections, where Marine Le Pen had a really astonishing 42%. That had actually very little to do with the EU, and much more with kind of general distrust against the elite, perhaps a deeply cultural moment, a culture war. And I've talked before the elections to Stéphane Séjourné. He's a leader of Renew and advisor to Macron. I said, well, Macron will probably win this time. But we have a real problem, because if the gap in our society is a rift between big cities and periphery, higher, lower educated, if we don't find a solution, and nobody has so far, the extreme right will come to power one day in France. Mm. So I think this external threat brings European Union together. Mm. But at the other hand, there are undermining forces from within each member state. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe that is a very good bridge to Monica, because also you mentioned it in the report, that it's through crisis that Europe has been actually leaping forward each time. While I remember in one of your papers, you were actually saying quite the opposite, that you said it's actually in crisis that you see where the sort of breaking lines are, and that it's not necessarily the unity that is shown. So maybe one reaction on this, and also on the point of the European sentiment will depend on the EU's ability to deliver. But what's the role, and the sentiment is not sort of coming from top down, but it actually has to come from below as well. So, and how is culture then playing into that? Monica.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those easy questions. Yes, I think crisis is a crucible, I think, is a moment where things go one direction or the other. I think historically they have posed problems for European identity, or they have spurred the European organization, European institutions to try and forge a European identity. And I also like the fact that the report starts with this idea, we still have these open questions about European belonging or sentiment or identity. Is it a prerequisite for further integration or in fact for continuing integration? And how does it come about? How do we promote it, which is also your kind of second question. And I think what is interesting, and actually what the report demonstrates, is that perhaps you don't necessarily need a strong identity to become closer. These two crises now have shown it. And in fact, I'm always a bit suspicious of this idea of a strong identity. I think it tends to become essentialist and also exclusivist and also divisive and, generate conflict, which is what we are seeing today. And I think also Europe doesn't really stand a chance to have an essentialist identity. That is not the way European ideas and narratives of European identities have developed. Luckily, I think they are more about complexity, in fact. And when Pawel said about this is a deeply cultural moment, I think it is because it's a complex moment. Strong identities are often about simplification, us and them, and that's all very easy and neat. Well, not easy, but at least neat. And instead, culture is at ease with complexity, and the world is indeed complex, and is what makes us navigate this complex world, and what gives us a direction and tells us what we should desire and the kind of good life that we should aim for. So that's what culture tells us, and it's a kind of in this sense, is a kind of the engine of history, I would say. So this is a deeply idealist or culturalist argument, perhaps. But on the issue of how then the European sentiment comes about, I switch to a more materialist argument and say that in order to have a joint shared sentiment, you probably most of all need joint shared material conditions. And I think also the report and the response to the crisis show that in many ways. So shared duties and rights and constraints and possibilities that make us, for instance, a common or at least a European public sphere. For instance, in the role of the media, also the report says that you can have tell different stories if it is within the same European public sphere, so national variants or local variants or other kinds of variants, but there is this kind of shared basis, if you like, and that is a material basis, is actually, yes, culture makes you navigate in this complex sea that we find ourselves in, and often there has been this metaphor of being in the same boat, but actually it's probably more a sea. And then when you see that somebody is in a flashy boat and somebody else is in a rusty raft or maybe even swimming, then I think then the most likely sentiment is one of betrayal. And instead, if we are probably have to build also cultural boats there. Just to close on this metaphor.
Like we need a speedboat.
Yes.
For this, merci, Monica. And Galyna, now I took the liberty to ask you in that first round as the last contribution, because obviously Ukraine had not been part of that inquiry. I would say, and it's a pretty clear and stark storyline we have been following with Pawel's presentation. What do you make of this when you hear it? And because it can be also very Eurocentric.
Yes, but you know, here I've read the report, and Ukraine is almost everywhere in each question. Then we are talking about, not about pandemic, but about security. That's about threats to Europe. That's about culture also. Ukraine is everywhere because the situation in Ukraine is quite crucial. Ukraine unites all 27 EU member states symbolically here because this is a common threat for all of them. And here in this report I can see that I really appreciate these infographics here. And here is one very specific one. How many kilometers is from the capital of EU country to the capital of Ukraine? And the far from Ukraine country is, the more safely the country, mostly the more safely that country feels, except of, let's say, Sweden, because Sweden shows very huge solidarity with Ukraine, even being very far from it. And Ireland, of course, too, because in Ireland there are a lot of sentiments towards Ukrainians, maybe because of very similar past. What can I see here too? I can say that perception of the biggest threats to Europe, there are two of them, Russia and migration, which are combined in the report. And I can see as a conflict analyst that here the cause and effect are meeting in this report, because Russia is the cause of migration crisis, which is the biggest fear for 27 EU countries. So if you will cure the cause, the effect will be less. And what can I say? Now Europe is facing the biggest refugee crisis in its history after the Second World War. And what is done already? In the March 4 Temporary Protection Directive came in force, and not only neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia are helping Ukrainians, are letting Ukrainians in, but also we have 400,000 of Ukrainians in Germany. Here in the Netherlands, there are only 21,000 of Ukrainian refugees, and Mark Rutte was saying that Netherlands is ready to give shelter for 50,000 of them. So solidarity is enormous, and this is my first reaction on this report. Thank you.
Merci, Galyna. Pawel.
I have spoken so much, maybe I will skip the first round.
Okay. I just wanted, in terms of the geopolitical dimension of this, we stay here? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, it's too short time to go in all to the 5 dimensions, just to repeat them, that we are all on the same boat. In this, there is what the report has really been analyzing, has been the question of international security and defense, of climate and energy, on financial solidarity, on the rule of law and migration. And media and culture is really going as a red thread throughout these dimensions. And I really agree, actually, what you have been saying, that this is actually also for us a special culture moment, that in that complexity, it's actually culture that can help us understanding the almost understandable in that context. And if I may go to you, Monica, as our cultural specialist on that table, back to the European sentiment and the creativity that is needed to be unlocked also now in that situation. we often hear that the culture should be better acknowledged, should have a much more pivotal role in the European project, because it is not acknowledged neither by national governments nor by the EU. It is chronically under-financed, under-resourced. What are we doing wrong?
Well, I don't know. That's the short answer. But actually, I've been thinking about it, and one thing that I want to start pointing out that I think could be useful for an answer is that, for instance, even in this report, and it's not a criticism, but culture is not one of the policy sectors that is not one of the 5. And still the report, of course, says that a flourishing cultural sector is important for the development of a European sentiment. But then culture is still, throughout the report, is spoken about a lot. And I think that is because culture is, at the very least, 2 things, and there are 2 very different ways to look at culture. One is culture as the cultural sector, in which case it is a policy area, or it can be. But then there is also culture is in what may be called the more anthropological sense, which is a much wider transversal subject, which is difficult to, it cannot really be promoted as a sector because it's transversal. It deals with basically is relevant for all of the sectors, and is also a very sensitive matter because it is also very much linked to identity. And in fact, I'm made to think of a metaphor that is actually, I think, originally a Dutch idea, which is this idea of the pillars, in the sense that, and also because it's central, for instance, now when we talk about climate and sustainability, there is this idea of the 3 pillars of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social. And so what is culture? And in fact, there is a big debate, should culture be the 4th pillar? And maybe yes, it should be a 4th pillar. There should be more energy in communicating about it and making sure it's not the poor cousin in policy matters. But then there is this kind of structural problem with culture or issue. The culture is also just not a pillar, is also, in some representation, is now made as the roof of the old building, but I think it's probably more like the foundation, because it's not something that you put on top, is what really needs to be there from the very beginning to make sense of it all. So I know I haven't answered the question, but I think there is this to be considered, the fact that culture is both a sector that can be promoted, and I think all the initiatives, for instance, for having at least 2% of national resilience plans devoted to culture, all these initiatives are important, but there's also this relationship of culture as a transversal, more foundational component, which is there and which may be more difficult to promote on its own.
Thank you also for making indirectly a connection to the cultural deal for Europe, because with our partners Culture Action Europe and Europa Nostra, we have launched a cultural deal for Europe, which was actually asking for the 2% from the recurring resilience funds for culture, which we actually succeeded it not in individual 27 EU member countries, but in an aggregated fashion. Part of the advocacy is also related to making culture the 4th pillar. And indeed, the challenge I see is that it is the culture sector calling for it. While if we talk about culture as the fundament of our society, it should not be the culture sector, but the community of Europe calling for it. And there again, the challenge, how do we change it? How do we unlock the creativity, the imagination of our citizens, that they actually perceive that substantial need for Europe to have that cultural fundament?
Well, I get culture has this role of unlocking, and probably especially the cultural sector. So those who, making the distinction here in saying those people and institutions that are particularly devoted to creating and conveying, so sharing is very important, conveying objects that are cultural, so objects, both material and immaterial ideas, of course, are cultural objects, that have a meaning. That is, having meaning is what culture is about. And so writing stories, creating narratives, and I think that's precisely is the role, not to stick to what already exists, but to imagine what maybe doesn't even exist now. That is also the role that has been given to the arts, historically, especially by modern society. Is art have this particular responsibility to be irresponsible in a certain way, to play and to make us imagine what we cannot see yet. So I think that is what the cultural, the sector is for, and if it sticks to that, I think it can do it well. And I also wanted to say something, given that I still have the floor, about this fact that, we often use these architectural metaphors, the pillars, and for Europe, it's all the time architectural metaphors, the common European home, or, well, even European fortress is not that good, but it's still, an architectural metaphor, the architects of Europe, the euro as our, bridges and on them. And I think also the European Pavilion now with this new initiative of the ECF is, so there's clearly a need to imagine ourselves into a kind of home, a place where we can represent ourselves and to others. And I think that this is done in a complex way that is trying to reimagine radically what Europe is promising.
Merci, Monica. Galyna, how does it sound for you? I mean, now we are in war, but we hope that in the aftertime, culture will play also, or will have a role to play also in the healing process and the coming together and in the rebuilding also of Ukraine. Now, you are, again, more an expert in geopolitical questions, but does it echo for you, this kind of conversation around culture as a pillar?
Of course, it is, and I think that narratives which we are building, which we are reproducing, they are our cause of conflicts very, very often. And today I've read Maxim Osipov's article, which was published in Dutch here, and very respectful, let's say, newspaper. And narratives he reproduced there, he is sort of good Russian. Narratives he reproduces, they can be the causes of the war, because he says that Ukraine and Russia are brothers. And this is like Cain and Abel metaphor. Ukraine and Russia never were brothers, because Ukraine has much deeper and longer history. So it is like grand-grand-grand-grandfather and grand-grand-grand-grandchild. And he also says that his grandfather was running from Nazi occupation in the Second World War, and he was taking with him a book in German by a German author. And he said that maybe right now, like Ukrainians fleeing from the war, from the aggression from Russia, they are taking with themselves books written by Pushkin or Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. We had free choice what to take with us. We are not forced to take books, but each of us did it. And my biggest daughter, he took Fanny Fleck's fried green tomatoes in the We Still Stop Cafe. It is about racism and about love between two women in America. in US. My middle daughter, she took Harry Potter, the last part of it, and it is very heavy because we just carried it on us. And my small one, she took Matilda by Roald Dahl because they perceived that this is something that belonged to them. We were not forced to take this. What else I'm like perceiving, not like from this situation. I was working in the Ministry of Education and Science for a while, and I also was an international student in South Korea, and I appeared here as a result of communication with my classmate then, because he called me to flee from Ukraine to Netherlands. We already had like this initial trust, and initial trust can be born when people are starting together, they are sharing their values together. So normally, like statistically, people are just like running to their bordering countries and are waiting there, then the war is over and then it is safe to get home again. Here, I just like, me and my family, we made such a long trip because this trust existed before. And what can I say? Almost 6 million of Ukrainians are refugees right now, and a bigger part of them, except of 700 in Russia, they are forced to flee, not to flee, but they are just removed, they are forcefully. But like the bigger part of them, they are here in EU, and this temporary protection directive gives them right to study here, to children, to students, to study here. And I received here in the Netherlands truly this act of academia solidarity. I applied to a scientific or teaching position here, and I received a response in a week that I can teach in the University of Amsterdam, and I'm truly happy and grateful for that. Like the Dean of Political Department offered me a lectural place, and Charlotte Hill, another professor, she just shared thesis students with me. So this act of solidarity brings a lot and teaches a lot. And what can I say? That children in schools, in EU, students in universities, teachers everywhere, they are not like just exchanging facts of knowledge. They are feeling this unity, this sentiment. And for sure, the bigger part of Ukrainians, they are not like people who are just want to settle here. We want to return, and we want to bring these values with us. And you know, to stop aggression as soon as possible is truly meaningful, because people whose houses are already not existing, they would be like eagerly trying to stay here. If it is still any kind of hope to have anything left there, and just like we would return and we will be grateful for this shelter given to us here, and we will transmit values with our gratitude to Ukraine, and in Ukraine it will never be possible to make authoritarian regime. And I think that here in this situation, like Europe is uniting. Europe is like proving this potential to be democracy and to fight autocracy in this Russian aggression. Thank you.
Galyna, it's also very encouraging to hear this, because this week actually we had lunch with a colleague of ours from Ukraine who gave us quite a different picture also about the Ukrainians' disillusion, anger and sadness about Europeans, other Europeans, EU Europeans, and that we have that impression again that there's a lot of solidarity out there, but actually that when you are still in the war zone, you feel pretty alone, and that this actually nourishes very strong anti-European feelings. So I'm glad to hear your other narrative, and I know it's sincere. Merci. I was also wondering, it sounded like culture could be the compass when you mentioned earlier that these books have been accompanying you and actually giving you that hope that you need in that moment. Peter? No, Pawel. Pawel, no.
Can I react to it?
Yes, please.
I enjoy listening to all of you. And Monica has great metaphors, the one of the house, the one of the boats. I think it's with our project, we also used a metaphor of the compass, and it was on purpose. And it merits perhaps some explanation, because I believe that the compass is needed on those waters, which are right now stormy. But it is also needed because Europe is losing, or has its sense of direction has been shaken by those crises. And I mostly refer to the fact that Europe used to be a peace project. There is no peace anymore. In a way, it's a paradoxical. In front of our eyes, we can see what Europe was about. But at the same time, perhaps we need a new purpose. And if this is true, then this is a moment of the opening which requires creativity. That's why this free flow of ideas is so important, and that's why the role of the media and the culture is so crucial in allowing us to be able to use the compass properly. I also wanted to comment on the fact that we are using a concept of European sentiment, which is a little bit a way of not talking about European identity, because identity is such a loaded concept. It closes more doors than it opens. So we wanted to open the doors with using a much softer word, less provocative, but I believe still very useful of a European sentiment, which is somewhere in on a level down on the building. But still, the question as to how European culture should be defended, the free culture should be defended, it will be a taboo question, a difficult question. I wouldn't want Brussels to be responsible for promoting European identity. I think this would be a tremendous mistake, but I still believe that there are parts of the job that also Brussels could do. So for example, on the media are already part of the rule of law monitoring. I see no reason why the freedom of cultural expression shouldn't be included there. But then I also feel that I'm not sure what your experiences are from this campaign of 2% for the culture. But I believe that there are several places in Europe where culture is still looked through the prism of a thing for the elites, whereas the rest of the people still need bread and butter. So societies in Europe differ on this culture générale. So in France, maybe this notion that culture is needed is more widely accepted, but it's not necessarily the case everywhere. And finally, I also feel that we are living a moment where European sentiment has strengthened thanks to the crisis, or if things can happen thanks to the crisis or because of them. But I also feel plenty of dangers for the disappointment. So just going to those rallies of support for Ukraine, people are calling for closing the sky, halting the imports of Russian energy, sending more arms. And those political decisions are so difficult that actually there is a lot of potential for disappointment. And also, while there is solidarity right now, it is not given. It's not certain that it will last forever. And in particular the issue of migration, if this turns out to be a longer migration and not a temporary one, can be easily exploited by some political forces and already is in some respects. Although, and I will finish on that note, it is still very interesting for me to note that Europeans are discussing Ukrainian refugees completely in a different way than they used to discuss refugees and migration 7 years ago. And I ask myself a question of what does it tell us about Europe and European culture?
I think with applause means also we can take questions now. Are there any questions from the It's hardly difficult to see. Is there anyone that has a burning or less burning question to one of the panelists? Monsieur, please. And if you could, because we don't have a mic, but I think if you speak high, loudly, we will all hear you. Please go ahead.
As a, sorry?
Human rights.
Human rights.
This cultural dimension you are mentioning more as a human rights-based approach, and is that not more global, an international cultural framework that we should rely on? Is that also not questioning the borders and the fluid borders of Europe, and how to keep on thinking about that? And for example, this week in Barcelona, the Eurocities will come up with a declaration on the migration issue and tell the story from the cities to the European Commission that we should use the situation now to come up with a totally different migration and open policy to the rest of the world and to have legal pathways. This all is human rights based. Is that not the basic we should go back to if you talk about culture?
Thank you. No, that's really interesting, and I agree on the human rights issue. So first of all, in theory, is either 3 pillars with a roof, and the roof is culture, or 4 pillars. No, this is how it's been, talked about, and it is true that it's mainly talked about with regards to sustainable development agenda. So it is a global issue, not just European. So I was using that, I was taking for Europe something that is also a global issue. Culture is, well, there are cultural rights as well as human rights is a complex, is also a complex matter, and in a way, one could also look at the specific cultural rights, among which there is the, the ability, the permission to speak your own language, educate your children in that culture. So there are specific cultural rights which can be therefore managed as we manage political, social, and civil rights as well. So Europe, of course, only the relationship between what is European and what is global becomes, becomes difficult here. Europe can only speak for itself and find good solutions for itself when it's talking about its own policies. And I think that the crisis is a good occasion to rethink migration policy in particular. And well, let's see if it's possible to grasp it. I don't know.
Peter, you want to add?
No.
No? Maciej, we had another question.
I had a question because you seem to be quite, having a liking to different metaphors. And this question of European sentiment versus or European sentiment and European identity. I have to say personally, I also have hard times sometimes grasping the notion of this European sentiment. I understand that it goes back to the writing of Denis de Rougemont. I think it also gets tricky when we try to translate it into other languages. But I was wondering if you maybe had some metaphors in mind. Again, identity versus sentiment. Pawel started talking about how spatially, I mean, one might be above another. But I mean, if you could elaborate on that, or if you have any thoughts in general. I think the metaphors are great, by the way, because they can replace this, European lingo that is sometimes, having a lot of burden in our discussions in Europe.
Is that for me? I don't know.
Everyone.
For everyone.
Okay. Well, identity is more than a metaphor for me. It's an analytical concept, which is problematic because it's also a practical concept used by people in every day, but is also, has been sort of talked about and discussed in several disciplines, emerging from psychology and then identity politics and etc. So that's why, in fact, I prefer, in a way, identity, even though I agree is terribly divisive and a problem, but at least it's also a concept as a history of, or at least I'm, for myself, more comfortable. Sentiment, for me, in fact, is more of a metaphor, or I struggle to use it as an analytical concept. Perhaps a psychologist would have an easier time, I don't know. I think it's an interesting move, though. I mean, I try to then analyze the move from identity, which definitely was in vogue in the 90s, to now that we're talking of sentiment. And I think, on the one hand, is a kind of this shift that I think is we can see it in many other areas, with a kind of a shift towards more intimist, if you like, private, and because of all the security crises that there have been, this more move towards the idea of resilience, and which is, but I mean, I haven't studied it now, I'm just replying to a question. So I think it is an interesting, in fact, move that we are now talking about the sentiment rather than identity. But I don't know.
If I can briefly respond to it. For me, European sentiment is also a para-analytical concept, but it's good. It allows experimentation, which is actually in keeping with what should happen in the culture sphere. It's not just different from European identity, which is loaded, but it's also different from opinions. So we are used to looking at public opinion polls and trusting that opinion is all that matters. But I believe that there is something else behind the opinions, because opinions are rational, but there is also something which is a bit less rational, which is hidden. Of course, it doesn't mean that we have a tool to identify those sentiments among Europeans, but at least with the concept, we show that we mean something else than just the opinions. And finally, talking about European sentiment allows us to look at different actors, so not just Europeans and their sentiments, but also the European approach of the governments or of different actors. So you can you can use this concept for it opens several doors, and that's what I like about it. Although, again, this was for us a prototype mission and an experimentation with this concept. First time that we used it in such a methodological way.
Galyna?
Yes, I just want to add, just to link in between sentiment, identity, and migration and culture. I'm pretty sure I'm just following thoughts of John van Dijk, who is a Dutch thinker, discourse analyst, and then he says that teachers and journalists, they are symbolical elite of all the societies, because what we can feel is already like taught us in schools, let's say, and it is transmitted by the culture, and we not are just reproducing the ideas or the concept which are in our culture. We can change the discourse. And now this is a moment of crisis, this is a moment of change. The best books about, from Ukrainian side, let's say, the best films about Ukraine are not filmed and are not written yet. And this is crisis will give us the possibility to rethink this concept of migration. And I hope what like migrants from Ukraine will help to rethink all the concepts, because this is the very first time from the Convention of 1951, which was written after the Second World War. Then migration by European nation is happening inside of the Europe. And like as my host family says, they are looking at me and they clearly, they feel the solidarity, they feel something very similar, and they just like think if something, things haven't never happened, but if something happened in this Netherlands, where will they go? They said that they will go to Brussels, and they will say they will sit there still, and they will wait. Then it will be over. So they think of us not like from different from the other, from different people. It is a chance to make the Europeans more human to each and everyone, just like to make this sentiment of like the refugees, just to make them it their own, just to feel it from inside. Thank you.
Merci, Galyna. Peter?
Oh.
I think it was a tour de table.
No, but just I agree with you. I would hope that it would give us a more humane perspective on refugees, also from other parts of the world. I very much doubt if that is the case, because I think really because people from Ukraine are from Europe, they are white, they are kind of Christian background, they're mostly women and children. I think things will be very different if we have another wave of black Muslim Africans, whether we like that or not.
It was also one of the points in the report, of course, that you are more inclined to develop that sense of togetherness for something you know.
Yeah, but I think that's
religion and culture.
Yeah, that's logical, and I think also perhaps we should feel too guilty about it. But on the other hand, there's really a food for thought. If you think, what's the difference between Ukrainians now and the Syrians of 2015, who were also fleeing for a terrible war, much violence, partly also Russian violence.
Yeah. And that's also an expectation from some of the citizens, exactly, to open up. And also we look at the asylum policy of the EU, and that this is actually reinforcing dividing lines that are already there through these very different treatments of where you come from. I realize, and I see that we are already 1 minute over time. Thank you very much. It has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for taking your time, for joining us, and I hope we will continue in the bar. Thanks a lot. Stay tuned.